overriding point. Donor funding, whether it's from the EU or from other donors, provides NGOs with more revenue than reliance on other sources. Well, that's an obvious point again, but we wanted to set out and actually nail it and actually prove it does, because more revenue equals a greater funding, a focus on policy, on education, and involvement with regional and transnational networks. Now, this is very important because the literature was very, very critical of donors. And there was almost this assumption that they'd be better off without donors. NGOs would somehow, if this whole circus went, then particularly the EU, then things would be better somehow. But actually, when you look at what the impact of donor, longer-term impact of donor, it elevates NGOs and civil society to a completely different level. And I think that's an important thing to dispel some of the more negative commentary of the past. But the research illustrates that the impact of medium-term, long-term donor assistance is a widening resources gap between richer and more successful NGOs get richer and more successful, but the gap between them and the fledgling or low-level capacity NGOs, in fact, widens. And there again, there's an interesting discussion there about the impact. I was giving a similar paper at LSE at the conference a few weeks ago, and somebody from the field, practitioner, said, well, why, who are you blaming? It's not about apportioning blame, it's about refining the strategy and acknowledging that there is a differentiated impact. I'm not for 1 minute, and I'm sure that this, I won't get the same comment in an audience like this, but it's not about saying it doesn't work. It's about saying what bits of it work and how can we improve and strengthen that aspect. And one of the key things is doing something about this widening gap. Now, we talk about an elite of NGOs, again, leaning a little bit towards irrational, so I think they're rational actors, and of course they're going to hang on to the capacity and develop professionalism as any organisation or institution would. But it's about looking again at some of the rhetoric around dissemination and making sure there is a wide dissemination of that knowledge and partnership. And I'll say a little bit more when I put some of my data up. We find, and have found time and time again, that although there are partnerships emerging in all of these countries, all the locations between urban-based organisations and regional small organisations, often these are very hierarchical relationships. And that what they do is the funding reinforces, or the project reinforces existing hierarchies. And you get, my research system has a wonderful term, I can't remember it for a moment, but you get this kind of, where the organisation in the field, the partner in the field, is simply the implementing partner, and doesn't have the capacity to then manage a grant or manage a project of their own. And we see this emergence of two groups of NGOs, some with clear transactional capacity that tend to be donor funded, and another section where they can't really access donor funding, and they remain rooted in strategies around participation rather than transactional activity. Now, a few NGOs do combine both. They follow a West European trajectory where successful civil society organisations, social movement organisations, manage to combine the two aspects of activities. Lobbying, governance work with a kind of foothold in community action. And I think that's the model that probably all of us would agree that we want to see the civil society dialogue and civil society organisations being about. The problem is, it's very difficult for community-based organisations at the moment in these countries to actually graduate, if we want to use that term, majority term, graduate to more transactional activities. Okay, there isn't the opportunity structure for that to take place. And my final point, the findings, on this slide, rather than final point per se, is that we need to look at the types of funding available. Now, when we spend a lot of time talking to NGOs, as lots of us do doing work on the region, but what becomes very evident is that two organisations having the same EU assistance grant, 12-month, 18-month project, one will deliver very much more, or obtain much more benefit than the other. And our concern was, why is that so? The key thing seems to be relations with a number of donors and how the different relations and donors actually interact. The key thing, time and time again, is block grants. If an organisation has a block grant for 3 or 4 years that elevates its resource endowment, then that does seem to deliver a significant dividend. It means that when an EU small grant through EPA, cards as it was, EPA, is then deposited on that organisation, the effectiveness of that grant will be much greater. In other words, if an organisation survives solely on one EU project grant after another, then that does not lead to a particularly effective developmental trajectory or strategy. Okay, so, yeah, can I just do very, very quickly? 10 seconds. Well, actually, I won't. I'll do it because I'll just say a little bit about, if we go a bit further forward. Just very quickly, some of the findings here. I'm sorry about I did this very quickly on tables. But one of the things we're interested in is short-term. Yes, evidence suggests that the duration of EU system is predominantly short-term. And I think there are all sorts of issues which probably come out in the course of our discussion about that sort of short-termism and how effective it is as a means of delivering aid. For me, the biggest problem is it's not so much the short-term nature of the grants, it's the fact there is no opportunity for renewal. There's no opportunity to say this was a very effective project in a particular municipality or canton or neighbourhood, let's roll it out and expand it. The only opportunity is to put in a grant for maybe for an entirely different core. I don't want to turn to the next one. Let me just move to the third one, because this is a very important finding, I feel. In the quantitative work, you see here 52 out of, or 75% said yes, the project involved in working with government, state and institutions. We then, through our interviews and qualitative research, we found that actually in the vast majority of NGOs, the project involved interaction at a very low level. Sometimes getting some kind of certificate or some kind of guarantee of access or a supported letter. There was only in very few cases where there was real policy dialogue or around policy and things. So that's something that we felt is not reflected often in the quantitative work, but when we did more qualitative analysis, that was very important. And yes, just this one, and then I'll shut up. And that is, getting the knowledge and the capacity out of the urban-rural divide. The majority of projects are seated either in capital cities, like this Sarajevo or Belgrade, or in large urban centres, Mostar, Tuzla, Banja Luka, Niš. It's very difficult to get the roadshow beyond those urban centres, and I think that is a very important challenge. As I said earlier on, when it does happen, if you go to the delegation in Sarajevo or in Belgrade, and you see this map of the country, and there's EU projects all over the country, and that's true, there are EU projects all over the country, but when we pitch our tent and visit some of these very rural locations where there's an EU project, the role of the local NGO is an ephemeral role. It's an implementing role, and it's not a role about building the capacity for them to engage in dialogue.
Thank you so much for this interesting